Thomas found the newborn twins with ice crusted on their eyelashes and less than an hour left to live, their mother already frozen in the snow beside them. What the wild Mustang mare did next, and what it demanded of a dying man with only weeks to live, would shatter everything he thought he knew about sacrifice. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter wind howled across the Montana plains like a wolf searching for prey, carrying with it crystals of ice that stung any exposed skin. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and the sky hung heavy with clouds that promised more snow before nightfall. In this unforgiving landscape, where survival was a daily battle even for the hardiest creatures, two tiny forms lay huddled together in a shallow depression beneath a cluster of bare cottonwood trees. They were foals, newborns no more than a day old, their wet coats already crusted with frost and their frail bodies trembling violently against the cold that threatened to steal their last breaths. The larger of the two, a filly with a coat that should have been cream but now appeared gray with ice, pressed herself against her brother, trying to share what little warmth remained in their failing bodies. Their mother, a domestic mare who had wandered too far from her owner's ranch during the early stages of labor, lay motionless 20 feet away. She had given birth to the twins during the height of the blizzard the night before, her strength completely spent. The snow had already begun to cover her still form, nature's way of reclaiming what it had taken. The foals had tried to nurse, their instincts driving them to search for the sustenance they desperately needed, but their mother's body had grown cold hours ago. Now, with no milk, no shelter, and no protection from the brutal elements, the twins were living their final moments. The filly let out a weak, pitiful whinny, barely audible over the wind. It was a sound of pure desperation, a call into the void hoping for an answer that logic said would never come. Her brother, even weaker, could only press closer to her, his breathing shallow and irregular. Ice had formed around their nostrils, and their legs, which should have been carrying them on wobbly adventures of discovery, lay useless beneath them. They had no strength left to stand. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles across the frozen landscape, smoke rose from the chimney of a small cabin. Inside that cabin, a man named Thomas Whitehorse sat in his worn leather chair, staring into the flames of his wood stove. Thomas was 73 years old, a veteran of Vietnam who had seen more death than any man should have to witness. The war had taken pieces of his soul that he had never quite recovered, and the years since had been a slow march toward an end he had long ago made peace with. 6 months earlier, the doctors at the VA hospital had given him the news he had been expecting. Stage 4 cancer, inoperable, 6 months to live, maybe a year if he was lucky, though Thomas never quite understood what was lucky about prolonging the inevitable. He had chosen to spend his remaining time in the cabin his grandfather had built, surrounded by the wild country he had always loved, far from the pity in people's eyes and the sterile smell of hospitals. The cabin was sparse but warm, heated by the wood stove that Thomas fed with logs he could barely lift anymore. His medication sat on the small kitchen table, a regimen of pills that dulled the pain, but also dulled everything else. Lately, Thomas had been taking fewer of them. He wanted to feel something in these final weeks, even if that something was pain. It reminded him he was still alive, still part of this world for a little while longer. On this particular morning, Thomas had woken with a strange restlessness, a feeling he could not quite name. It pulled at him, urged him to do something, though he had no idea what. He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked to the window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed into a kingdom of white and silver. The sun, weak and pale, struggled to break through the clouds, casting the world in shades of gray. Thomas squinted across the expanse, his eyes drawn to movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, shadows playing across the snow. But then he saw her. A mare, massive and gray as the storm itself, moved with purpose across the frozen ground. She was Wild, one of the Mustang herds that still roamed these remote corners of Montana, and she was unlike any horse Thomas had ever seen. The mare stood nearly 17 hands high, her body thick with winter coat, her mane and tail flowing like waterfalls of silver. She moved with the confidence of a creature that had survived countless winters, that knew the secrets of staying alive when everything conspired toward death. Thomas watched as she stopped, her head raised, her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. She was searching for something. Then she began to move again, this time with increased urgency, her powerful legs carrying her swiftly across the snow. Thomas felt his heart quicken. Something was wrong. He had lived in wild country long enough to recognize the behavior of an animal responding to distress. Without fully understanding why, Thomas reached for his heavy coat, the one lined with fleece that hung by the door. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, fumbled with the zipper. The simple act of dressing exhausted him, but the strange compulsion that had woken him now drove him forward. He pulled on his boots, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and grabbed 2 blankets from the chest at the foot of his bed. One was gray wool, military issue from his service days. The other was orange, bright and synthetic, something he had bought years ago for emergencies. He did not know why he was taking them. He did not know what he would find. But something deep inside told him that today, on this frozen morning, he needed to go out into the cold. The cold hit Thomas like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside. His lungs seized, struggling to process air that felt more like ice than oxygen. For a moment, he stood on the porch, allowing his body to adjust, watching his breath form clouds that disappeared almost instantly in the wind. The snow beneath his boots crunched with each step, that particular sound that only happened when temperatures dropped well below freezing. Every step was an effort. The cancer had weakened him more than he cared to admit, stealing his strength one day at a time, but stubbornness had always been one of Thomas's defining characteristics. If he was going to die, he would die on his feet, doing something that mattered. He followed the direction where he had seen the gray mare, his eyes scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. The landscape was deceptive, with drifts and shadows that could hide almost anything. Thomas had walked perhaps a quarter mile, his chest burning with exertion and cold when he heard it. A sound so faint he almost dismissed it as wind. But then it came again, a weak, desperate cry that pierced through the morning air. It was the sound of something dying, something young. Thomas changed direction, moving toward the sound, with renewed determination despite the protest of his failing body. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Beneath the cottonwood trees, partially hidden by a drift of snow, were the 2 foals. They lay together, their small bodies barely distinguishable from the snow around them except for the occasional tremor that ran through their frames. Thomas had seen death many times in his life. He had held dying men in his arms in the jungles of Vietnam, had watched the light fade from eyes that moments before had been full of life. These foals were close, so close to that final crossing. Their breathing was shallow, their eyes glazed. The ice that had formed on their coats gave them the appearance of fragile ice sculptures, beautiful and tragic. But it was what he saw beyond the foals that made Thomas's breath catch. The gray mare stood there, perhaps 15 feet away, her massive body positioned between Thomas and the dying twins, her eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on him with an intensity that was almost human. She did not move, did not threaten, but her presence was a clear statement. These foals were under her protection. Thomas had heard stories from the old-timers, tales of wild mares adopting orphaned foals, of the mysterious ways that herd animals sometimes behaved that defied simple explanation. But he had never witnessed it himself. This mare, who had not given birth to these domestic foals, who had no biological connection to them, had found them somehow in the vastness of this frozen landscape and had claimed them. Thomas slowly lowered himself to one knee, the movement sending sharp pains through his joints. He kept his eyes on the mare, showing her through his body language that he meant no harm. He spoke softly, his voice rough from disuse. He had not spoken to another soul in weeks. The words came slowly, carefully chosen. He told the mare he wanted to help. He told her the foals would die without intervention, that the cold was too much for their newborn bodies to survive. He did not know if the mare understood his words, but she understood something. Her ears, which had been pinned back in warning, slowly relaxed. She took one step back, then another, giving Thomas room, but not abandoning her post. Moving as carefully as he could, Thomas approached the first foal, the filly. Her eyes rolled toward him as he drew near, but she lacked the strength to react further. Thomas removed his gloves and placed his bare hands against her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak and rapid, the frantic beating of a heart, trying desperately to keep a body alive. Her body temperature was dangerously low. Without immediate warmth, she would be dead within the hour. Her brother was even worse off. When Thomas touched him, the colt barely responded. His breathing was so shallow that Thomas had to watch carefully to confirm the small chest was still moving. Thomas unfolded the gray blanket and carefully wrapped it around the filly, tucking it close to her body. Then he did the same with the orange blanket for the colt. The blankets would help, but they were not enough. These foals needed to be somewhere warm, needed to be fed, needed medical attention that Thomas was in no position to provide. The nearest veterinarian was over an hour away in good weather, and the roads after a storm like this would be impassable for days. Thomas looked up at the mare, who had been watching his every movement. "What are we going to do?" he asked her, his voice barely above a whisper. "How am I supposed to save them when I can barely save myself?" The mare stepped forward then, closing the distance Thomas had put between them. She lowered her massive head toward the foals, her nostrils flaring as she breathed in their scent. Then she did something that Thomas would remember for the rest of his days, however many he had left. The mare lay down in the snow beside the wrapped foals, the heat from her enormous body immediately creating a buffer against the killing cold. She arranged herself carefully, creating a windbreak with her bulk, and then she turned her head to look at Thomas. The message was clear. She could provide warmth, but she needed his help for the rest. Thomas understood. This was not a rescue he could accomplish alone, and it was not one the mare could manage either. They needed each other. The dying man and the wild mare, two creatures who had no reason to trust each other, were being asked by fate to work together to save two innocent lives. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, something that had nothing to do with the cancer eating away at his body. For the first time in months, he felt purpose. Thomas knew he could not carry both foals back to the cabin. Each one probably weighed close to 60 or 70 pounds, and in his weakened state, carrying even one would push him to his limits. But leaving them here, even with the mare's warmth, was not an option. The temperature was still dropping, and the clouds gathering on the horizon promised another storm before nightfall. He made a decision. He would carry the colt first, the weaker of the two, and return for the filly. It would mean 2 trips through the bitter cold, but there was no other way. Thomas gathered the orange-blanketed colt into his arms, feeling the frightening lightness of the small body. The foal's head lolled against his chest, and Thomas could feel the rapid, thready heartbeat against his own. He looked at the mare, who had risen to her feet when he picked up the colt, her eyes tracking every movement. "Stay with her," Thomas said, nodding toward the filly who remained on the ground, wrapped in the gray blanket. "I will come back. I promise I will come back." The mare's ears flicked forward, and though Thomas knew it was foolish to attribute human understanding to an animal, he could have sworn she nodded. The walk back to the cabin was agony. Thomas's arms burned with the effort of carrying the colt and his legs trembled with each step. The wind had picked up again, cutting through his coat and stealing what little body heat he had managed to preserve. His breath came in ragged gasps, and more than once he stumbled, nearly falling into the snow. But each time his legs threatened to give out, he thought of the filly waiting under the cottonwoods, of the mare keeping watch, trusting him to return. He thought of all the men he had carried in Vietnam, the ones he had saved and the ones he had lost, and he pushed forward. When Thomas finally reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and staggered inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, and for a moment he simply stood there, the colt still in his arms, letting the heat soak into his frozen body. Then training and instinct took over. He moved to the wood stove and carefully laid the colt down on the rug in front of it, as close to the heat as he dared without risking burns. He added more wood to the fire, building it up until the stove radiated waves of warmth. The colt did not move, did not open his eyes, but Thomas could still feel that faint heartbeat. Thomas grabbed every towel he owned and began rubbing the colt's body, trying to stimulate circulation and help warm the tiny creature faster. The ice in the colt's coat began to melt, soaking the towels and dripping onto the floor. Beneath the frost and grime, Thomas could see that the colt's coat was pale, almost white, with the faintest hints of dappling. He would have been beautiful if he had been born in spring, in a warm barn with attentive care. Instead, he had entered the world in the worst possible circumstances and now fought for every breath. But Thomas could not stay. The filly was still out there, and every minute that passed was a minute closer to losing her. He forced himself to stand, his muscles screaming in protest. He took a moment to catch his breath, to drink some water and assess whether his body could make the return trip. The honest answer was that he did not know. The walk back had taken everything he had, and now he was being asked to do it again. The pain in his chest had intensified, that deep gnawing ache that the doctors had warned him about. But the alternative was unacceptable. He could not leave that filly to die. Thomas stepped back out into the cold, and this time it felt even more brutal. His body, briefly thawed by the cabin's warmth, rebelled against the shock of the freezing air. He pulled his coat tighter and began walking, each step measured and deliberate. He focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on the rhythm of movement, on anything except the growing weakness in his limbs and the burning in his lungs. The distance seemed twice as far this time, the landscape stretching endlessly before him. When he finally saw the cottonwood trees again, relief flooded through him. The mare was exactly where he had left her, lying beside the filly, her body curved protectively around the small form. She raised her head as Thomas approached, and he saw recognition in her eyes. She remembered him. She had waited. Thomas dropped to his knees beside the filly, his legs finally giving out. He reached out with shaking hands to check her condition, and what he found terrified him. The filly was colder than her brother had been, her breathing even more labored. Time was running out. Thomas tried to lift her, but his arms would not cooperate. The strength that had carried him through the first rescue had been completely depleted. He tried again, managing to get the filly a few inches off the ground before his muscles gave out, and he had to set her back down. Panic began to creep in at the edges of his mind. He had promised to save her. He had promised the mare he would come back, and now he was failing. He looked up at the massive gray mare, and words he never expected to say came tumbling out. "I need your help. I cannot do this alone." What happened next defied everything Thomas understood about wild animals and their behavior around humans. The mare stood and moved closer to Thomas, positioning her body beside him. She lowered her head and gently, carefully, began to nudge the wrapped filly with her nose, pushing the tiny bundle toward Thomas. It was as if she understood exactly what he needed, as if she was trying to help him lift the foal. Thomas used the mare's body to pull himself up, leaning against her solid warmth for support. She stood perfectly still, accepting his weight without flinching. Together, With Thomas cradling the filly and the mare providing stability, they began the journey back to the cabin. The journey back to the cabin with the filly became a test of pure will for Thomas. His vision blurred at the edges, and several times he felt consciousness trying to slip away from him. But each time darkness threatened, he felt the solid presence of the mare beside him, her warmth radiating through his coat, her steady pace matching his stumbling steps. She walked so close that Thomas could lean against her shoulder when his legs faltered, and she adjusted her speed to accommodate his failing strength. It was the most extraordinary thing Thomas had ever experienced, this wild creature offering herself as a living crutch to a stranger. They moved as one entity across the frozen landscape, the dying man, the wild mare, and the tiny foal suspended between life and death in Thomas's arms. The wind picked up again, howling around them, but the mare positioned herself to block the worst of it, using her massive body as a shield. Thomas found himself talking to her, his words coming in gasps between labored breaths. He told her about Vietnam, about the friends he had lost, about the weight of surviving when so many had not. He told her about the cancer, about the loneliness of his final months, about how he had been waiting to die until this morning when everything changed. The mare's ears swiveled back to catch his voice, and Thomas imagined she understood every word. When the cabin finally came into view, Thomas felt tears freeze on his cheeks. He had made it. They had made it. But as they approached the porch, a new dilemma presented itself. The mare stopped at the base of the steps, refusing to go further. Thomas understood. She was wild, had probably never been inside a human structure in her life, and the doorway represented a boundary she could not cross. But she also would not leave. She stood there, her eyes fixed on the bundle in Thomas's arms, every line of her body radiating concern and determination. She had brought them this far, and she was not abandoning those foals now. Thomas managed to climb the 3 steps to his porch, each one requiring a monumental effort. He pushed through the door and immediately felt the blessed warmth of the cabin. The colt still lay where Thomas had left him, unmoved, but with steam rising from his damp coat, a sign that his body temperature was slowly rising. Thomas laid the filly beside her brother, unwrapping the gray blanket so the heat from the stove could reach her more directly. He grabbed more towels and began the same rubbing process he had done with the colt, trying to bring warmth back into her frozen body. The filly was in worse condition than her brother. Her breathing was so shallow that Thomas had to place his hand on her chest to confirm she was still alive. Her eyes remained closed, and when he gently opened one eyelid, the pupil was sluggish to respond to the light. Thomas had seen enough death to recognize when a creature was standing at the threshold. This little one was barely holding on. He worked frantically, rubbing her legs, her neck, her body, trying to stimulate blood flow. He brought warm water and carefully dripped it onto her gums, hoping to raise her core temperature from the inside. Outside, the mare began to pace. Thomas could hear the heavy thud of her hooves on the porch, the occasional snort of frustration. She wanted to see the foals, needed to confirm they were safe, but the cabin's interior was too alien, too confining for her wild instincts to overcome. Thomas looked at the door, then at the foals, then back at the door. An idea formed in his exhausted mind, one that made no practical sense but felt absolutely right. He went to the door and opened it wide, propping it with a chair so it would not swing shut. The cold air rushed in, and the temperature in the cabin immediately began to drop. But Thomas did not care. The mare stood at the threshold, her large head extending through the doorway as she assessed the situation. She could see the foals now lying together by the stove, and Thomas saw something change in her expression. She took one tentative step inside, then another. Her hooves clicked on the wooden floor, a sound so incongruous with the rustic cabin that Thomas almost laughed. Here was a wild Mustang, a creature that had never known captivity, willingly entering a human dwelling because the foal she had claimed needed her. She moved slowly, carefully, until she stood over the twins, her head lowered to breathe in their scent. Thomas watched in amazement as the mare began to do something he had never witnessed before. She lay down on the floor beside the foals, folding her powerful legs beneath her body and curling herself around them in a protective arc. The movement was deliberate and gentle, creating a warm, living barrier between the foals and the cold air coming through the open door. Her body heat, combined with the warmth from the stove, created a pocket of air that quickly grew warm and still. The filly, who had not responded to any of Thomas's efforts, suddenly released a small sigh and nestled closer to the mare's belly. Thomas slowly closed the door, watching to see if the mare would panic, but she remained calm, her attention focused entirely on the foals. He moved to his kitchen and put water on to boil. The foals would need milk, or something close to it, if they were going to survive. Thomas had powdered milk in his cupboard, and while it was not ideal for newborn horses, it was better than nothing. He mixed it with warm water, making it thin and easy to digest, and found an old bastard that he could use to feed them. His hands shook as he worked, partly from exhaustion and partly from the realization of what he was attempting. When he returned to the living area, he found all three animals exactly as he had left them. The mare's eyes tracked his movements, but she did not stir. Thomas knelt beside the colt first, gently opening his mouth and squeezing a small amount of the milk mixture onto his tongue. At first, there was no response, but then the colt's throat worked in a weak swallow. Encouraged, Thomas continued, giving small amounts and waiting between each dose. The process of feeding the foals was painstaking and slow. Each drop of milk mixture had to be carefully administered, with time given for the foals to swallow before the next dose. Thomas worked with the patience of a man who understood that rushing could mean the difference between life and death. The colt responded better than his sister, his swallowing reflex stronger, his body accepting the nourishment with small signs of recognition. But the filly remained nearly unresponsive, and Thomas had to work twice as hard to get even half as much liquid into her. The mare watched every movement Thomas made with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Her large dark eyes followed the bastard from the bowl to the foals' mouths, tracked Thomas's hands as they supported the tiny heads, observed each swallow with what could only be described as maternal concern. When Thomas finished feeding the colt and moved to the filly, the mare shifted slightly, positioning her body to give him better access while still maintaining contact with both foals. It was a dance of trust, this interaction between wild animal and human, each learning to read the other's intentions and movements. Thomas managed to get perhaps an ounce of liquid into the filly before she stopped swallowing altogether, the effort too much for her exhausted body. He sat back on his heels, his own body trembling with fatigue. The pain in his chest had become a constant companion, a dull roar that spiked with each breath. He knew he was pushing himself far beyond what his doctors would consider safe, but safety had ceased to matter the moment he decided to walk out into that frozen landscape. These foals needed him, and that need gave him a reason to keep going that all the medication and rest in the world could not provide. Night began to fall, and with it came the promised storm. Snow started as small flakes but quickly intensified into a driving wall of white that erased the landscape beyond the cabin windows. The wind shrieked around the corners of the small structure, finding every crack and gap to exploit. Thomas added more wood to the stove, building the fire up until the metal glowed red. The cabin grew warm, almost too warm, but he did not dare let the temperature drop. The foal's survival depended on maintaining that warmth through the long, brutal night ahead. Thomas made himself a cup of coffee, his first of the day, and realized with some surprise that it was already evening. The entire day had passed in what felt like moments, consumed by the desperate effort to save two lives. He had not eaten, had barely drunk any water, and his body was paying the price. But when he looked at the foals, still breathing, still alive against all odds, he felt a satisfaction that went deeper than physical comfort. The mare had not moved from her position, her body curved around the twins in perfect protection. She had not eaten or drunk either, had not relieved herself, had simply maintained her vigil with unwavering dedication. Thomas prepared another batch of milk mixture and began the feeding process again. This time, the colt took the liquid more eagerly, his small throat working in stronger swallows. It was progress, definite and encouraging. The filly, however, remained worryingly unresponsive. Thomas worked with her for nearly an hour, managing to get only small amounts into her system. He spoke to her constantly, his voice low and soothing, telling her to fight, to hold on, to give life one more chance. The mare joined him, lowering her massive head to breathe warm air over the filly's body, as if trying to share her own vitality with the failing foal. As the night deepened, Thomas found himself fighting to stay awake. The exhaustion of the day, combined with his illness, pulled at him with irresistible force. But he could not sleep, not yet. The foals needed feeding every 2 hours if they were going to survive, and he had set his old wind-up alarm clock to ensure he maintained the schedule. He made a makeshift bed on the floor near the stove, using cushions from his couch and extra blankets. When he lay down, he found himself within arm's reach of the foals and the mare. It was unconventional, to say the least, but nothing about this situation was conventional. The first alarm came at midnight. Thomas dragged himself from sleep that felt more like unconsciousness, his body protesting every movement. He prepared the milk, warmed it carefully, and fed both foals. The colt took his portion readily now, even making small sounds of contentment. The filly managed a bit more than before, though she still had not opened her eyes. Thomas noted each small improvement, each sign that the battle was not yet lost. The mare remained awake, her eyes reflecting the firelight, her presence a constant comfort in the dark cabin. The second feeding came at 2 a.m. The storm outside had reached its peak, the wind so fierce that it rattled the windows in their frames. Thomas worried about the cabin's ability to withstand such force, but the old structure held firm, built by his grandfather's skilled hands to weather the worst that Montana could deliver. He went through the feeding routine again, his movements becoming automatic, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought struggled to function. The warmth, the repetition, the soft breathing of the animals, all of it created a cocoon of purpose that held Thomas together when his body wanted to quit. At 4 a.m, when the alarm sounded for the third time, Thomas discovered something remarkable. The colt had his eyes open and was looking around with evident curiosity. His head lifted slightly when Thomas approached, and there was an alertness in his expression that had been completely absent before. Thomas felt tears spring to his eyes. This one, at least, was going to make it. The filly, however, remained unchanged, her small body limp and unresponsive. Thomas fed her with extra care, willing her to show some sign of improvement, but she gave him nothing. The mare seemed to sense his worry, and she moved her head to rest it gently against Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that nearly broke him. Dawn arrived with a silence that felt almost sacred. The storm had blown itself out during the early morning hours, and now the world beyond the cabin windows lay buried under fresh snow that sparkled in the pale light like scattered diamonds. Thomas had not slept more than 20 minutes at a time, his rest broken by the alarm clock's persistent ringing and his own worry about the foals. When the first rays of sun crept through the windows, he found himself staring at the filly, searching for any change in her condition, any sign that she was fighting her way back from the edge. The mare had finally dozed off sometime around 5 a.m, her head resting on her folded legs. But even in sleep she remained alert. Her ears swiveled toward every sound, and her body stayed curved protectively around the foals. Thomas envied her ability to rest while remaining vigilant, a skill he had once possessed in Vietnam but had lost in the decades of peace that followed. He pulled himself up from his makeshift bed, his joints cracking in protest, and shuffled to the kitchen to make coffee and prepare another batch of milk mixture. While the water heated, Thomas looked at himself in the small mirror that hung by the sink. The face that stared back was haggard, gray-skinned, with dark circles under eyes that had seen too much. He looked like a man at the end of his road, which was exactly what he was. But there was something else in those eyes this morning, something he had not seen in months. Purpose, direction, a reason to wake up and face another day. He splashed cold water on his face and returned to the living area where his unlikely family waited. The colt was awake and alert, his head turning to follow Thomas's movements with clear interest. When Thomas knelt beside him with the baster full of milk, the little one actually opened his mouth in anticipation, a response that filled Thomas with joy. He was learning, understanding that this strange human brought food and comfort. Thomas fed him slowly, letting the colt take his time, and was rewarded with enthusiastic swallowing and a small, contented sigh when the meal was finished. The transformation from the frozen, nearly dead creature of yesterday to this responsive foal was nothing short of miraculous. Then Thomas turned to the filly, his heart heavy with dread. She looked exactly as she had all night, unchanged, unresponsive, barely clinging to life. He prepared himself for another difficult feeding session, expecting the same struggle to get even tiny amounts into her. But when he gently opened her mouth and placed the first drops of milk on her tongue, something astonishing happened. Her throat worked in a strong, deliberate swallow, then another. Then, Thomas froze, hardly daring to breathe, and administered another small amount. Again, she swallowed. Tears streamed down Thomas's weathered face as he continued feeding her, and this time she took nearly as much as her brother. The mare woke fully as Thomas worked with the filly, and she too seemed to sense the change. She raised her head and watched intently as the little one's body showed its first real signs of vitality. When Thomas finally sat back, his hands shaking with emotion and exhaustion, the mare lowered her head and gently nuzzled the filly. The tiny foal, eyes still closed, made a soft sound and moved her head toward the mare's warmth. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She was not just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live. Thomas knew he needed to care for the mare as well. She had been in his cabin for nearly 18 hours without food or water, her own needs completely subordinated to the welfare of the foals. He filled a large bucket with fresh water and set it near her head. The mare drank deeply, the sound of her swallowing loud in the quiet cabin. Then Thomas faced a new problem. The mare needed food, but he had nothing suitable for a horse. His own supplies were meager, meant for one human living alone, not for feeding a massive wild mare. He remembered seeing a bag of oats in his small storage shed, something his grandfather had kept for emergencies. Thomas bundled himself in his coat and ventured outside for the first time since yesterday's rescue. The cold was less brutal than before, and the storm had scoured the air clean. Everything sparkled with fresh snow, and the silence was absolute. Thomas made his way to the shed, his boots crunching through the deep drifts, and found the oats exactly where he remembered. The bag was old, but the oats appeared sound, protected from moisture by their sealed container. Back inside, he poured a generous amount into a basin and set it before the mare. She sniffed it cautiously, then began to eat with obvious hunger. Thomas watched her, this magnificent wild creature who had chosen to trust him, to enter his home, to partner with him in saving the foals. He wondered what force had brought them all together, what cosmic coincidence had aligned their paths on that frozen morning. His grandfather, who had possessed more wisdom than formal education, would have said it was the spirits at work. that everything happened for a reason, even when that reason was not immediately clear. As the morning progressed, Thomas established a routine: feed the foals, tend to the mare, maintain the fire, rest when possible. The colt grew stronger with each feeding, and by midday he was attempting to lift his head and look around with genuine curiosity. The filly's progress was slower but steady, her responses becoming more consistent, her body temperature rising toward normal. The mare remained their constant guardian, leaving her post only briefly when Thomas opened the door to let her relieve herself outside, and even then she hurried back as quickly as her massive frame could move. Thomas found himself talking to all three animals throughout the day, sharing stories from his life, thoughts he had never spoken aloud to another soul. He told them about his wife, dead now for 15 years, about the children they never had, about the loneliness that had become his constant companion. The mare listened with her dark, intelligent eyes, and Thomas imagined she understood the weight of his words, if not their specific meaning. There was something profoundly healing about caring for these vulnerable creatures, about being needed in such a fundamental way. By the third day, the transformation in the foals was remarkable enough to seem impossible. The colt, whom Thomas had started calling Ghost because of his pale coat, was now attempting to stand. His first efforts were comical and heartbreaking in equal measure, his long legs splaying out in different directions, his body wobbling with no sense of balance. But he kept trying with the determined persistence that defined all young horses, falling and rising again without complaint or hesitation. The mare watched his efforts with what Thomas could only interpret as pride, occasionally nudging him gently with her nose when he fell too hard. The filly, whom Thomas named Hope, for reasons he felt no need to explain, was recovering more slowly, but her progress was undeniable. She could now lift her head for extended periods, her eyes were open and tracking movement, and she took her feedings with growing enthusiasm. Thomas found himself spending hours simply sitting beside her, stroking her soft coat, talking to her about anything and everything. She seemed to find comfort in his voice, relaxing visibly when he spoke, and Thomas found that caring for her eased the constant ache of his own mortality. The mare had settled into life in the cabin with surprising ease. She still did not fully trust the enclosed space, and Thomas made sure to leave the door propped open whenever weather permitted so she could come and go as she pleased. But she rarely ventured far, never more than a few minutes outside, before returning to check on the foals. Thomas had cleared out his small living room, pushing furniture against the walls to create more space for the mare to move comfortably. His cabin had become a stable, and he found he did not mind the transformation in the slightest. On the fourth morning, Thomas woke to find Ghost standing on his own, wobbling but upright, his tail swishing with evident satisfaction at his accomplishment. The colt had managed to rise sometime during the night, and now stood beside the mare, who had risen as well, her body positioned to catch him if he fell. Thomas sat up slowly, not wanting to startle the foal, and watched with a smile as Ghost took his first tentative steps. They were uncoordinated, his legs moving in a rhythm that seemed to surprise even him. But he was walking, moving forward into life with the unstoppable momentum of youth. Hope watched her brother's achievement from her position on the floor, and Thomas saw something that might have been determination flicker in her eyes. She too wanted to stand, to join her brother in this new milestone, but her body was not yet ready. Thomas moved to her side and stroked her neck. "Your time will come," he told her softly. "Do not rush it. Healing happens at its own pace." He spoke as much to himself as to the filly, thinking of his own body's betrayal, the cancer that would not be reasoned with or hurried along to suit his preferences. That afternoon, Thomas experienced a setback of his own. The pain in his chest, which had been manageable with careful movement and shallow breathing, suddenly intensified into something that took his breath away entirely. He was in the kitchen, preparing the milk mixture when it hit, a crushing pressure that drove him to his knees. The bowl he had been holding crashed to the floor, and the mare, who had been dozing in the living area, was on her feet instantly. She moved to him with surprising speed for such a large animal, lowering her head to him in what felt like concern or even comfort. Thomas gripped the edge of the counter, fighting through waves of pain that threatened to pull him under. He had experienced episodes like this before, knew they were a sign of his body's continued deterioration, but this one was worse than any previous attack. For several terrifying minutes, he truly thought this was the end, that he would die here on his kitchen floor with the mare standing over him. But gradually, slowly, the intensity lessened to something bearable. His breathing eased, and his vision cleared. The mare stayed beside him the entire time, her warm breath on his face, her solid presence an anchor to consciousness. When he could finally move again, Thomas pulled himself up using the mare's neck for support. She stood perfectly still, allowing him to use her strength to compensate for his weakness. It was a reversal of their roles from that first day when she had needed him to save the foals. Now he needed her, and she gave her support without hesitation or judgment. Thomas rested his forehead against her shoulder for a long moment, gathering himself, accepting the reality that his time was growing shorter. The question was no longer if he would die, but whether he would live long enough to see the foals fully recovered and able to survive without him. The episode left Thomas weak and shaken, but he forced himself to continue with the feeding schedule. Ghost, now mobile, came to him rather than waiting to be fed, his small hooves clicking on the wooden floor. Thomas prepared fresh milk mixture and fed both foals, noting with satisfaction that Hope was now taking substantial amounts. She was gaining weight, her ribs no longer quite so visible beneath her coat, and her eyes had lost that glazed, distant look that spoke of a creature hovering between worlds. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Thomas sat in his chair for the first time in days. The mare stood near the foals, who were both resting peacefully, and the warmth from the stove created a cocoon of comfort against the cold outside. Thomas felt the pain in his chest as a constant companion now, but he also felt something else: peace. A sense that despite the hardship, despite the approaching end of his own life, he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. He thought about the randomness of fate, how a restless feeling had driven him from his bed that frozen morning, how the mare had found the foals in a landscape so vast they should never have been discovered in time. He thought about all the small choices and circumstances that had aligned to create this moment, this unlikely family, gathered in a cabin that suddenly felt less like a place to die alone and more like a home. Thomas had stopped believing in God during the war, when he saw what men could do to each other in the name of righteousness. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the steady breathing of the animals he had saved and who had in turn saved him, he wondered if perhaps there was some force in the universe that brought together broken things so they could help each other heal. The following days brought both progress and decline in equal measure. Hope finally stood on the 6th day, her legs shaking with effort, but holding her weight for nearly a full minute before she collapsed back onto the blankets Thomas had arranged for her. The mare celebrated this milestone with gentle nickering sounds, and Ghost, now walking with increasing confidence, approached his sister and touched his nose to hers in what looked remarkably like encouragement. Thomas watched the interaction with tears in his eyes, amazed by the capacity for connection and support that existed between these animals. But as the foals grew stronger, Thomas grew weaker. The episodes of chest pain came more frequently now, sometimes multiple times per day. He had stopped taking most of his medications, finding they did little to help, and only made his mind foggy when he needed clarity to care for the foals. His appetite had disappeared completely, and he sustained himself on coffee and water, occasionally forcing down a few bites of bread when his hands shook too badly to be trusted with the foal's feedings. He was dying. There was no pretending otherwise, but he was determined to hold on long enough to see his task through to completion. The mare seemed to sense Thomas's decline with the same instinct that had led her to the foals that first morning. She began staying closer to him, positioning herself so he could lean on her when he needed to move around the cabin, and more than once she woke him from dangerous sleep by nudging him when it was time for the foals to be fed. Thomas found himself depending on her in ways that should have felt humiliating, but instead felt like partnership. They were a team now, working together to raise these orphaned foals, each contributing what they could to the shared goal. On the 8th day, something extraordinary happened. Thomas was sitting in his chair, too exhausted to stand, when Hope walked over to him on her own. Her steps were uncertain but deliberate, and when she reached him, she lowered her head into his lap. Thomas placed his trembling hands on her soft neck and felt her warmth, her vitality, her absolute determination to live. This creature, who had been hours from death when he found her, was now seeking out human contact, offering comfort to the man who had saved her. The circle of care and compassion was complete. Ghost, not to be outdone by his sister, trotted over with increasing coordination and pressed against Thomas's leg. The old veteran found himself surrounded by life, by youth and energy and hope, and the contrast with his own fading vitality could not have been starker. But instead of making him sad, it filled him with a profound sense of accomplishment. These foals would live. They would grow strong and fast, would run across open fields, would experience all the things that life had to offer, and he had made that possible. In the closing chapter of his own story, he had ensured that 2 other stories could begin. The mare approached and completed the circle, her massive body forming a protective barrier around Thomas and the foals. In that moment, Thomas felt more at peace than he had in decades. The nightmares from Vietnam that had plagued him for 50 years were gone, replaced by dreams of running horses and open plains. The loneliness that had consumed him since his wife's death had been filled by this unlikely family. The fear of dying alone, which had haunted his final months, had been transformed into the certainty that he would be surrounded by love when the end came. But Thomas knew he needed to make plans for what would happen after he was gone. The foals still needed care, still required regular feeding and protection from the elements. They were too young to survive on their own, and while the mare had proven herself an extraordinary guardian, she could not provide everything they needed. Thomas thought about his nearest neighbor, a rancher named Margaret, who lived about 5 miles down the valley. She was a good woman, practical and kind, with experience raising horses. If he could just get word to her, explain the situation, perhaps she would take the foals when the time came. The next morning, Thomas attempted to write a letter. His hands shook so badly that the words were barely legible, and several times he had to stop because pain overwhelmed his ability to focus. But he persisted, explaining in brief sentences about the foals, about the mare, about what he was asking. He included instructions for their care, noted their progress and their individual personalities. He sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it on the kitchen table where it would be easily found. Then he added a note to his will, which he kept in a drawer, leaving what little money he had to Margaret to help with the foals' care. These preparations exhausted him, and Thomas spent the rest of the day drifting in and out of consciousness in his chair. The foals played nearby, their energy boundless now, their recovery almost complete. They chased each other around the cabin in clumsy circles, occasionally bumping into furniture and once knocking over a lamp, which the mare caught with her body before it could shatter on the floor. Thomas watched through half-closed eyes, too tired to correct their behavior, and found their antics more entertaining than anything he had seen in years. That night, as Thomas performed what he somehow knew would be one of his final feedings, he spoke to each animal individually. He told Ghost that he was brave and strong, that he would grow into a magnificent horse. He told Hope that her determination to survive was an inspiration, that she had taught him the true meaning of resilience. And he told the mare, this wild creature who had chosen to become domestic for the sake of two orphaned foals, that she was the most remarkable being he had ever known. The mare looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes, and Thomas felt certain she understood that he was saying goodbye. Thomas woke on the 10th day to find he could barely move. The pain had become all-encompassing, a fire that burned through every nerve and muscle. His breathing was labored, each inhalation requiring conscious effort that left him exhausted. He knew with absolute certainty that he had very little time left, perhaps hours, certainly no more than a day or two. But when he managed to turn his head, he saw the foals playing together near the stove, their movements now graceful and sure, their bodies filled with the vibrant energy of youth. They had made it. Against all odds, through freezing cold and near starvation, they had survived. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. His work was done. The mare knew. Animals always knew when death was approaching, and this magnificent creature was no exception. She stayed beside Thomas's chair throughout the morning, her head often resting gently on his shoulder or against his chest. She would not leave him, even when the foals called for her attention. Her vigil was absolute, a final act of companionship from one being to another. Thomas rested his hand on her neck, drawing comfort from her solid warmth, grateful beyond words that he would not face this final passage alone. Ghost and Hope seemed to sense the change in atmosphere as well. Their play became quieter, less boisterous, and they frequently approached Thomas to nuzzle his hands or rest their heads against his legs. They were saying goodbye in the only way they knew how, offering their presence as a gift. Thomas spoke to them when he had the breath, his words coming in short bursts. He told them to be good, to stay strong, to take care of each other. He told them their lives were precious and that he was honored to have played a part in preserving them. Around midday, Thomas heard a sound that penetrated through the fog of pain surrounding him. An engine, a vehicle approaching slowly through the deep snow. He tried to rise, but found he lacked the strength. The mare's ears perked forward, and she moved to position herself between Thomas and the door, protective even now. The engine stopped, and after a moment there was a knock. A woman's voice called out, tentative and concerned. Thomas recognized it immediately. Margaret, his neighbor from down the valley. Somehow she had come, though he had no way of getting the letter to her. The door opened slowly, and Margaret stepped inside, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. A dying man in a chair, a massive wild mare standing guard, and two healthy foals exploring the cabin with curious eyes. Thomas tried to speak but could only manage a whisper. Margaret crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside his chair, her weathered face creased with worry and compassion. She had known Thomas for 20 years, had respected his desire for solitude in these final months, but something had told her to check on him today. She saw the letter on the table, read it quickly, and understood everything. Thomas managed to grasp her hand with his own, which felt cold and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. He looked from Margaret to the foals and back again, the question clear in his eyes even if he could not voice it. Margaret squeezed his hand gently, tears running down her weathered cheeks. "I will take them," she promised. "I will care for them as you have. They will want for nothing." Thomas closed his eyes, relief washing over him. The last piece had fallen into place. The foals would be safe. Margaret stayed with Thomas through the afternoon, sitting beside him, sometimes talking about old times, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. She had brought supplies thinking she might need to check on his condition, but she could see that medicine had no role left to play here. This was simply about being present, about ensuring that a good man did not leave this world alone. The mare never moved from Thomas's other side, and the foals settled down to rest near his feet, creating a circle of warmth and companionship around the dying veteran. As evening approached and the sun began to set, painting the snow outside in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas felt himself slipping away. The pain was fading now, replaced by a strange lightness, as if he were becoming unmoored from his body. He thought about his life, about the good and the bad, the joys and the regrets. He thought about the war and the friends he had lost, and wondered if perhaps he would see them again soon. He thought about his wife and the love they had shared, and hoped she would understand why he had spent his final days caring for animals instead of mourning her. Most of all, he thought about the foals, about the miracle of their survival, about the privilege of being the instrument of their salvation. The mare lowered her head and placed it gently on Thomas's chest, her warm breath steady and calming. Ghost and Hope had woken and pressed close to his legs, as if trying to anchor him to the world with their physical presence. Margaret held his hand, her own tears falling freely now, and in that moment, surrounded by love both human and animal, Thomas Whitehorse let go. His final breath was soft, barely noticeable, like a sigh of contentment. The pain was gone, the struggle over, and he slipped peacefully into whatever lay beyond. The mare raised her head and released a sound unlike anything Margaret had ever heard. It was not quite a whinny or a neigh, but something deeper and more mournful, a farewell, an acknowledgement of loss. The foals, responding to the mare's distress, pressed closer together, their eyes wide and confused. Margaret sat quietly, giving them all time to understand and accept what had happened. She knew that animals grieved just as humans did, that they needed their moment to process the departure of a soul they had come to love. After a time, Margaret gently closed Thomas's eyes and covered him with a blanket. She would need to make arrangements, notify the proper authorities, handle all the practical matters that death required. But for now, she simply sat with the animals, sharing their vigil, honoring the man who had given his last days to saving innocent lives. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret stayed in the cabin that night, unwilling to leave the animals alone so soon after Thomas's passing. She fed the foals following the instructions Thomas had left, moved stiffly around the small space, and kept the fire burning through the long, cold hours. The mare remained close to Thomas's covered form for most of the night, as if standing guard over him one last time. Margaret watched this vigil with tears in her eyes, understanding that grief was not exclusive to humans, that this wild creature had formed a bond with the old veteran that transcended species and circumstance. The next morning, Margaret made the necessary calls. The authorities came to collect Thomas's body, treating him with the respect due to a veteran and a man who had clearly died in peace. They asked about the unusual situation, the wild mare in the cabin and the two foals, and Margaret explained as much as she understood. The story of Thomas's final days, his rescue of the dying foals and partnership with the wild mare, began to spread through the community. People who had barely known the reclusive veteran now spoke of him with admiration and awe. Margaret arranged for Thomas to be cremated according to the instructions in his will. He had wanted his ashes scattered on the land he loved, the wild Montana plains where he had found his final purpose. The small funeral service was attended by more people than anyone expected, neighbors and fellow veterans who had respected Thomas's desire for solitude, but now wanted to honor his memory. Margaret spoke briefly about the foals, about how Thomas had spent his last days caring for creatures who needed him, and there was not a dry eye among those gathered. The question of what to do with the mare became a topic of much discussion. She was wild, had always been wild, and by all rights should return to her herd in the mountains. But the mare showed no inclination to leave. She stayed with Ghost and Hope, protecting them, nurturing them, behaving in every way like their natural mother. Margaret decided not to force the issue. She transported all three animals to her ranch, setting them up in a large paddock with a shelter that opened to acres of pasture. If the mare chose to leave, she could. The fences were low enough for her to jump, and the mountains where her herd roamed were visible in the distance. Days passed, then weeks, and the mare remained. She grazed alongside the foals, taught them the ways of being horses, showed them how to read the wind and recognize danger. Ghost and Hope grew rapidly under her care, their bodies filling out, their movements becoming more coordinated and confident. They played and explored, always under the watchful eye of the mare who had chosen them over her own freedom. Margaret watched their development with wonder, documenting their progress, and frequently thought of Thomas and the legacy he had left behind. Spring arrived in Montana with its usual dramatic transformation. The snow melted, revealing the brown earth beneath, and soon green shoots pushed through the soil. Wildflowers bloomed across the pastures, painting the landscape in brilliant colors. Ghost and Hope, now 3 months old, had grown into beautiful young horses. Ghost's coat had developed into a stunning silver white with dappled gray markings, while Hope's was a pale cream that caught the sunlight like spun gold. They raced across the fields together, their joy and movement evident in every stride. The mare, whom Margaret had named Spirit in honor of her wild origins and noble character, had become something of a local legend. People came from neighboring ranches to see the wild Mustang who had adopted domestic foals, who had partnered with a dying man to save innocent lives. Some suggested Spirit should be captured and trained, turned into a valuable breeding mare, but Margaret refused to consider it. Spirit had made her choice to stay, and as long as she remained by her own will, she would be free to live as she pleased. One morning in late spring, Margaret arrived at the paddock to find something had changed. Spirit stood at the fence line, her body oriented toward the mountains, her ears pricked forward. In the distance, barely visible against the landscape, was a herd of wild horses. They had come down from their high country, drawn by the greening grass, and Spirit had heard their calls. Margaret's heart clenched. This was the moment. Spirit would have to choose between the wild freedom of her birth and the domestic life she had adopted for the sake of the foals. The mare turned and looked at Ghost and Hope, who were grazing peacefully nearby. She walked to them, touched her nose to each of theirs in turn, a gesture of affection and farewell. Then she turned back to the fence, and with a powerful leap that showcased her magnificent strength, she was over and running toward the distant herd. Margaret watched her go, tears streaming down her face, understanding that some creatures could never be fully tamed, that Spirit's wildness was fundamental to who she was. But then something unexpected happened. Spirit stopped halfway to the wild herd. She turned and looked back at the paddock at the 2 foals who stood at the fence watching her departure with evident distress. For a long moment, Spirit stood motionless, caught between 2 worlds, 2 families, 2 ways of being. The wild herd called to her with the promise of freedom and belonging. The foals called to her with the bonds of love and responsibility. Margaret held her breath, knowing this decision was Spirit's alone to make. Spirit turned away from the wild herd and began walking back. Not running, but walking with deliberate purpose. She reached the fence and jumped back into the paddock, and Ghost and Hope immediately pressed against her sides, their relief palpable. Spirit had made her choice. The foals were her family now, and she would not abandon them. Perhaps when they were grown and independent, she would return to the wild, but for now, her place was here. Margaret understood then the full measure of what she had witnessed. Thomas had saved the foals, yes, but in doing so, he had also created something rarer and more beautiful. He had forged a bond between creatures that should never have connected, had demonstrated that love and sacrifice could transcend all boundaries. His final act had been to bring together a family not of blood but of choice, and that family would honor his memory by staying together. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Margaret scattered Thomas's ashes across the pasture where Spirit and the foals grazed. The wind caught them and carried them across the land he had loved, mixing them with the soil that fed the grass that sustained the animals he had saved. It was a perfect circle, a completion of the story that had begun on that frozen morning when a dying man heard a call he could not ignore. The story of Thomas Whitehorse, spirit, ghost, and hope, became part of the community's collective memory, told and retold with variations but always maintaining its essential truth. It was a story about sacrifice and redemption, about finding purpose in unexpected places, about the profound connections that could form when beings chose to care for one another despite the odds. And every time Margaret looked at the 3 horses grazing in her pasture, she was reminded that miracles were real, that love was stronger than death, and that sometimes the most broken things could come together to create something whole and beautiful.